In 1 Corinthians 11, Paul finishes up his thoughts from the previous chapter. In verse 1, he says, "And you should imitate me just as I imitate Christ." And then he starts talking about corporate matters. He talks about instructions for public worship. Now, this can be really confusing for people, especially if you're new to the church or new to reading the Bible. So let's break this down a little bit. First, he's going to talk about public worship and the whole idea of head coverings. He says in verse 3, "But there is one thing I want you to know, the head of every man is Christ, and the head of woman is man, and the head of Christ is God." And so as you scroll down and read this for yourself, this is going to probably sound really strange to you because it's talking about women covering their heads and men not covering their heads and all kinds of really strange things. And in verse 16, he says this, "But if anyone wants to argue about this, I simply say that we have no other custom than this, and neither do God's other churches." And so for right now, I just want to encourage you to understand these two ideas. First of all, local customs, which is what he's talking about here in verse 16, sort of as he wraps up his instruction to them. And then the broader principles that are based on God's word. And so in verse 3, he talks about the principle. And the principle is one of subjection or submission, being submitted, that we should have hearts of submission to people in leadership over us. And specifically, this is talking about the idea that God has appointed for men to be spiritual leaders and for women to respect that. Now, that doesn't mean women have no role or no place or anything like that. So don't misunderstand this principle. And I'll put some links for more on this topic below this video. But the broad principle in general is that we should be submitted. Women should have a heart and an attitude of submission. And so culturally, the cultural image for that was head covering. So in their culture, just like even in some cultures today still, a head covering or a veil is all about a sign of submission. And so the principle is a principle of being submitted and humble and being subject to the leaders in our lives. But the specific cultural practice was this whole head covering thing. And so that's why I would say that the concept here in general terms is a principle of submission that applies to women and even to men as well. But the specific application of it in Paul's time, 2,000 years ago, was this custom of head covering. And in our culture today, we don't have that custom. That doesn't mean the same thing in our culture. And so you have to learn how to read this and understand what part of this is cultural and what part of this is broader than that and still applies to the general principle today. So anyway, I hope that helps out with this first section. Okay, now as we scroll down to the next section, Paul is going to talk about the Lord's Supper. Now, maybe you go to a church where you have communion and you have wafers and cups. And that's sort of what Paul's talking about here. But it's a little bit more than that because in their culture, they probably had this love feast where the whole church came together, Jews and Gentiles, rich and poor, young and old, and they shared food together, kind of like a big potluck. And then at the end of it, they would culminate that with the Lord's Supper, where they would remember the sacrifice of Christ. And so they would put Jesus right back at the middle of everything that they were celebrating. But as we read in verse 17, apparently that was going wrong in the church in Corinth. He says, "But in the following instructions, I cannot praise you, for it sounds as if more harm than good is done when you meet together." And so he's talking about divisions in the church. And he says in verse 20, "When you meet together, you're really not interested in the Lord's Supper. For some of you hurry to eat your own meal without sharing it with others. And as a result, some go hungry while others get drunk." Probably a reference to the difference between rich and poor, people who had a lot of food and drink and people who had nothing. In verse 22, he says, "What, don't you have your own homes for eating and drinking? Or do you really want to disgrace God's church and shame the poor? What am I supposed to say? Do you want me to praise you? Well, I certainly will not praise you for this." And then Paul goes on and describes how Jesus himself instituted the whole idea of the Last Supper and communion and how we should always do it remembering Jesus and remembering what Jesus taught us. And then in verse 27, he says, "So anyone who eats this bread or drinks this cup of the Lord unworthily is guilty of sinning against the body and blood of the Lord. And he says that's why you should examine yourselves before eating the bread and drinking the cup. So again, in the love feast preceding communion, they were completely disregarding the whole idea of loving one another and sharing with one another and elevating other people above ourselves. And then after doing all of that was so unchristian, they would still take communion and pretend to be focused on Jesus, even though in their hearts and in their lives, they weren't at all modeling it. And that's what Paul's talking about here. And so he says, so my dear brothers and sisters, when you gather for the Lord's Supper, wait for each other. So he's being very specific, but it's important for you to understand culturally what was going on in the church back in Paul's day, because if you don't, then it might be a little confusing as you try to apply it to your church in your culture today. So you're ready now to read 1 Corinthians chapter 11, and we'll see you tomorrow for chapter 12.